Welcome to Module 2 of EDD 918, and hopefully you have downloaded the slides, or at least you've got them pulled up there so that you can be seeing those as I go through this presentation today for this module. And again, I'm going to try and split it. I'm going to try for 2 videos. We'll see. It may end up being 3 as well. But again, I'd like to try and keep them just about 15 minutes. So in the first module, we just talked about what an organization is, what an organization does, a little bit about the structure, things like that. For this module, what I really want to focus on is kind of a brief summary of the history of organizational studies, and it's definitely going to connect with the history of management studies. And you'll see the articles for this week. One of them is called The Management Century. It's kind of an HBR, Harvard Business Review overview and things like that, and then the other 2 are specifically about org theory. But the 2 really kind of run together in the 20th century as we look at the history of things. So that's why there's going to be a lot of overlap. So if you've had a class in management before, probably some of this is going to be review, depending on what your background is with business degrees, things like that. But nevertheless, I want to jump right into this. I will say this, I'm going to spend a little bit more time, not in this lecture, it'll be in the second lecture, walking through what is known as the classical management, kind of the classical approach to management. I'll say more about that in that video. But the reason for that is it probably is the area still has the most influence, and we don't study it as much anymore because we've kind of shifted to some new perspectives. So we'll spend a little more time diving deep into that in that second video. But for this video, just want to do, as you see there, as you see on the slide there, the historical perspectives of organizational studies management. And I put on there a very brief overview, and I'm going to try and keep it real brief. The reality is I could dig pretty deep into this. I find it interesting. I find it fascinating. I started off life as a history teacher, so I really like historical perspectives. But nevertheless, but before we get into that first one, the Industrial Revolution, just real quick say this. We've seen organizations shaping human history since the beginning. But even just bringing it more modern, what we do is, I like to kind of start in that kind of colonial time period, Renaissance, the age of exploration, on up through the colonial period. And what you really see is, if you look at the history, none of that is studied in the management literature, by the way. So this is all pulling from history studies. But you see organizations, and you see the marrying there of government and other organizations, often for profit. So a lot of the exploration was a partnership of governmental sanctions and wanting to expand empires, things like that, mixed with trading companies and their businesses and organizations, and they worked together on those things. Now, by the way, just comment, not defending any of colonialism or imperialism or anything like that, just observing that's what was going on in that time period. And so, and it just made for some interesting partnerships, as well as then you even get into some discussions, well, who's actually in charge? Our own War for Independence was kind of rooted in, we had an agreement with Parliament as well as with the Crown, and then Parliament stepped in, and we said, and so there was discussions because of organizational issues, kind of. So anyway, it's just fascinating to see how that works. But I just say that to point out, organizations have been around. They're not a new thing. But then that brings us to the Industrial Revolution, and that is where we really start to see in organizational studies, management studies really start to come in. In the Industrial Revolution I'm specifically speaking of here would be the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, moving into the early 20th century and then throughout. And I realize there's, different iterations of the Industrial Revolution, but that's kind of that time period I'm really talking about. And one of the reasons why the Industrial Revolution kicked off this study of management and organizational life was because all of a sudden, for the first time, relatively speaking, you are bringing a lot of independent individual contributors into one building. So the way I always illustrate it when I would teach this in a live class when I have more time would be to talk about how, you've got your local businessman in a town who he's the carpenter. He builds all the furniture, right? He's a furniture maker in the town. Well, he goes out, he cuts down the trees, brings the trees in, and fixes wood. At the very least, he buys it from the local mill. Maybe he doesn't do all that, but he buys it from the local mill. But he takes care of the wood, he crafts it and everything else, and he builds, let's say, a table from the plain wood to finish and sells that. Not to mention that, where's his shop? Well, his shop is usually below or in front of his house. So he gets up in the morning, says goodbye to his wife and kids, but his commute is walking down the stairs. At lunchtime, goes upstairs, eats lunch, comes back down, works till evening. The kids are in and out depending on their day. It's very, very local. He does it all. It's all focused there. Then all of a sudden the Industrial Revolution comes, and we know the downsizing of farms, or actually the expansion of farms, more commercial farming. Small towns are going away. So you have more and more people moving to the cities for jobs, and they're getting a job in a factory. So you take that furniture maker, now he's in a factory. So in the morning, he literally leaves the house, says goodbye to his wife and kids, goes and works in the factory all day. But he's not making the entire table from start to finish. He's just doing this one little widget, right? And that's all he does. And that's what he put. And then it comes to him. He does his part, sends it down the line. Well, from a management standpoint, how do we do this? Because we've got a bunch of people who are used to literally being their own bosses. And now we've got to divide up the labor in the most efficient way. And how do we go about doing this? So the Industrial Revolution spawned that next bullet point there, what we call scientific management. And I am not going to say a thing about scientific management right now. I'm going to refrain, because that's the second lecture. That's what we're going to focus on, because it really does have an impact even on businesses today, or and organizations today, and how we approach organizational life. A lot of connection still to classical management. So we will come back to that. But what happened out of classical management, I'll just say this, the classical management approach you'll see in the next lecture is really mechanistic. So kind of the organization is a machine, and the individual people are cogs in the machine. I'm going to have you watch a video about that with Charlie Chaplin to kind of highlight that. So that was scientific management. That'll make more sense in the next video. So what happened then coming out of scientific management was we had the birth of the human relations era. And what is interesting about the human relations era is that we actually started considering people as people. And I know that sounds crazy to us today. But and I also want to be fair, and I want to be careful about this to the older ways of management. It isn't like that they didn't view them as human beings, right? I mean, it wasn't less thans or anything like that. But just their mindset was so locked into, you're our employee who comes in to do a job that we pay you to do, and then you go away. And we don't consider your feelings and emotions or ideas or anything like that while you're at work. You're here to literally tighten a widget. So the human relations era comes along. And this was born out of what was known as the Hawthorne studies. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the Hawthorne studies. It could be a whole lecture in and of itself. But basically, the Hawthorne studies, what we know as the Hawthorne effect in research, is where there's an impact on the research because the subject of the research changes their behavior because they're being observed. So we think about how it affects research. But really what came out of that, the true Hawthorne effect, actually related more to management and organizational life. Because it wasn't so much that the people modified their behavior because they were being researched. They modified their behavior because somebody was paying attention to them. That was the big revelation from the Hawthorne studies that kicked off the human relations era of, oh, the people in our companies, they want to be recognized as individuals. They want to be recognized as people. They want to be recognized that they have something to contribute, and they want to talk and have their ideas heard. So that gave birth to the human relations era, which then kind of overall, and I would say the Hawthorne studies, some of those things were kind of that key pivoting point that led into the human relations era. Then we shifted to the human resources era, and this is where it gets a little softer as far as where was the transition, when did that happen? Really not entirely sure. There isn't like that one big thing. I would say this: World War II contributed greatly to a lot of these areas of study, both the human relations and human resources era. Um, in that, what happened during World War II is government officials actually started going in and studying what was going on in factories, right? And so, because they wanted the munitions factories to be as efficient as possible to supply the weapons and ammunition, things like that, for the war effort. Well, but then that generated money, right? Because the government's going to put money into this research, which then coming out of World War II continued the studies in management and efficiency in factories and things like that. But the human resources era, really what it brought in is kind of, again, blending from that human relations era into the human resources era, was that workers have opinions and ideas. And so also what contributed to this was, well, hey, what's going to make you maybe work a little bit harder? So they started having those conversations. And so it was in the human resources era that we really started seeing studies develop, as well as writing develop, and then that being applied on motivation, ties to motivation for workers. So what are incentives, and how do we incentivize you? And benefits, right? We want benefit packages, and all of these things that really now are just part of, I mean, any kind of common language. You think about it now. If you go and look at a job posting, it's always a little humorous to me if you look at a job posting, because all of them say, we provide an excellent benefits package. But the reality is too, so, and I realize we have some folks who are kind of like, gig economy, and there's a little bit difference, but overall, offering me a really excellent benefits package isn't a motivator anymore. That's like, I expect that, right? Well, that's because of the human resources area. So we see how these things changed and affected. Also, what this brought in was the study of behavioral psychology into organizations. So how do people behave, and what's going to motivate them to work harder? What's going to demotivate them? We've got and I don't know if I'm going to have you read the article or not, but I will talk later on when we get into org behavior about a guy named Hertzberg, and he had some interesting theories about motivation and demotivation. All of that came about. So again, we have another module on org behavior, and we'll get more. If you're really interested in motivation and rewards and how that works, just stay tuned. We'll get to that. This is just kind of the intro of that. But that brought the human resources era brought people in. Now, again, it's a little bit hard when I call it the human resources era, because you might say, well, aren't we still in the human resources era? We still have HR departments or anything else. Yeah, but we shifted, meaning the focus isn't as much there anymore. It just has become so natural, and part of it, we don't call it that era anymore. So now we're really into what would be considered the modern era. And with that are some of the things we talked about in the first module. You have globalization, technology. How are those things impacting organizational life and workers and job security? So all of that's being considered. But also what we have now is, especially in developed nations, would be the rise of the information or knowledge worker. So classical management, again, we'll talk about that in the next lecture. It was really focused on the kind of factory industrial, to use a term that I don't enjoy using, but blue collar, right? That kind of, that was where that all came into play. Well, now we're in the age of most workers aren't paid for what they do with their hands. They're paid for what they do with their minds. And so we're in that era now of the information or the knowledge worker. And so that shifts again. So how do we incentivize those people? So we've seen things like flexible work arrangements and hybrid. And I know COVID kind of put a spin on all that. Some are trying to go back and others not. And there's some interesting conversations about that. But that was, I mean, the whole hybrid remote worker thing was going on pre-COVID. It's just COVID forced everybody into it. But how do we motivate those people? And I'll close this idea on the modern era where we are with just a couple of quotes. To me, they're old quotes, but they symbolize what this represents. Bill Gates, he said this, quote, "The inventory, the value of my company walks out the door every evening, end quote. So again, it's, the value of my company isn't the machinery, it's not our beautiful building, it's the people. And so there's more consideration given to that. Steve Jobs, he said this quote, "It doesn't make sense to hire smart people and then tell them what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do," end quote. And I think I said this in the last module, but it bears repeating. I want to make sure I'm clear. A lot of these things I say, I am not suggesting that every organization that claims these things does them. I mean, I know there's all kinds of stuff out there about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs when he was alive, when he was running Apple. So you can say, well, that's not true. I've heard bad things about Steve Jobs. So have I. I'm not suggesting these guys lived what they say they did, or that your company, maybe you're in a bad situation and they have these platitudes. I'm just saying this is the prevailing mentality that at least people give lip service to. So that's what we're dealing with. You don't know what a company is like, or an organization. I need to stop saying company. Organization is like until you get into it. Then you really find out what it's like. But at least this is where everybody says they want to be. So again, just kind of a quick, brief overview. I went a little bit longer than 15 minutes on this one. Sorry about that. But then we're going to dig into classical management in the next lecture.